My name is Elle, and I'm a transgender woman talking about doubt. I want to thank you for joining the program yet again. This episode will be aired on YouTube just as soon as I get it edited, and it is coming out a day late. I apologize for that, but that's kind of how life is going right now for me. I'm just on the finishing home stretch of my second master's degree in life, and it is building up. So here we are. I've almost made it now to a full year of recording Transgender Woman Talking on a weekly basis. And it feels like a little bit of an accomplishment, but also just it's been a grind as well, and also a joy and just a delight to get to meet so many new people through the show. Many of you have reached out and continue to reach out via email or Instagram messages. A couple people have sent me videos, which is delightful. So yeah, thank you for doing that. And just, it's a beautiful thing. And thanks for being here on the program. So like I said, I'm going to talk about doubt. And specifically, I'm going to talk about doubt about our identities, doubts about being trans. I think it's an experience that's common to many trans people, that doubt comes up. And as it turns out, we live in this cultural milieu, and I'm speaking specifically of American culture, so please forgive me if it's not the same in other places, but we live in this cultural milieu where there's a lot of pressure on us to be right, to be correct, to, when we say who we are, when we say that we're trans, it feels very consequential, and it feels like it's really important to be right. Part of that is that there's sort of this ongoing dynamic of this accusation that we are trying to deceive people, especially trans women, that we're really men, but that we're pretending to be women so that we can have access to women's spaces and women's groups, which is absurd and not true in any way. But that's the accusation, right? That we're out trying to deceive. And so, in that context of that accusation, it feels there's added pressure to have no doubts, to be crystal clear, to know exactly all the answers. And in fact, there are moments in which it feels dangerous to admit having any doubts. And at the end of the program, I'm going to come back to this, because this is not the first time in my life where I lived in a context that led me to feel afraid of admitting having doubts. You might be already predicting where I'm going with that. But I remember when I was early on, actually before I even fully started transitioning, or before I was even out to everyone, I was having conversations with my therapist at the time, and expressing to her, like, what if I'm wrong? What if I detransition? What if I decide that this conclusion that I came to was incorrect? What if I, have a change of heart or whatever? And besides the fact that all of that seemed extremely unlikely, her response was like, look, if you end up like telling them that you were wrong and you detransition, like, most of your family's going to be really, really happy, because they're not happy that you're trans. So they'll be relieved, there might be some embarrassment or whatever, but they're in the big picture, they're going to be happy about it, which was kind of a hilarious observation in a lot of ways. But really, trans people, we stand to lose a lot when we come out, right? We stand to lose friends. We stand to lose current and possibly or even likely future jobs. We stand to lose privilege, both cisgender privilege, but also for a lot of us, male privilege. We stand to lose relationships, our families, security, like just layers and layers and layers. We stand to lose a lot. And so again, that puts on the pressure. we need to be right. We need to have this correct. We need to be, doing the right thing. We need to be, just excuse me as I move my desk a little bit. But we need to make sure that we're correct about this thing. We can't be wrong. We could lose so much. And so, you don't want to lose so much over nothing or over an error, right? And, another dynamic that goes into doubt is that, I think that there are some trans people that think actually that this pressure is good. And so actually I think that some of this fear of doubt or the, existence of doubt is created internally, because I think there are some trans people that, are critical of so-called trenders, or, there are some degree of the trans community that is a little bit gatekeepy of itself. And so, sometimes there's folks, I feel like it especially comes out when we start talking about, non-binary people or people who wish to or feel as though they exist outside of, the two gender options that we've been given, at least in Western American culture. So some trans people would say, well, the pressure to get it right is a good thing because it weeds out folks that really aren't trans or that are just playing or whatever. And, I don't really agree with that. And honestly, I feel like if the gender system that we have were just dismantled altogether, it really wouldn't matter, because we all could just define what our gender is. We could move from one gender to the other, and it wouldn't matter. But as we have it, the gender system is built on this, hierarchical sex-based model. And in any sense, in any case, I think because of all these factors, because of the pressures on us to get it right, I think that it makes sense, and it's absolutely normal for trans people to have doubts, both before coming out and even after coming out. I mean, honestly, any sane person who happens to be trans, who happens to be trans, who is existing in this context, would be wise to be honest about their doubts. They would be wise to let them surface. Like any reasonable person, I think, would have some doubts. Now, there are a lot of different reasons why doubts might come up. That's sort of the cultural context. But then there are also sort of immediate experiential factors that might lead different people to have doubts. And some of these I share in, others of these I don't. But some of the common ones are, if folks, someone just, does not pass on a consistent basis for years and years and years, and, like 10 years into transition is still being read as their assigned sex at birth, or the gender associated with their assigned sex at birth, might develop some doubts about whether or not they're trans or whether or not they should have transitioned. Inability to find a partner is, I think, a common reason why for some people doubt comes up, because, we can get lonely. And I don't share in that because I'm someone who's married and I have that privilege. But I've heard a lot of, troubling stories about what life is like if you're, trans and on Tinder, for example. Another reason I think why some trans people have doubt is that we can sometimes have this implicit assumption that there is only one trans narrative, or there's only one way to be trans, or there's one universal trans experience, and if mine doesn't match that, then what does that mean about me, and do I belong, and am I really trans, and should I have done this, and etc. So that's, I think, is something that comes up for some people. And then I think cultural gaslighting, maybe especially from Christian culture, but we live in a culture that gaslights us and tells us that we're crazy, tells us that we can't trust our bodies, that we can't trust our experiences, that we're mentally ill, that what we really need to do is pray to Jesus or take a pill or whatever. And the reality is that it's gaslighting. We have decades and decades and decades of medical records and experience, at least in the Western world, about the experience of people with gender dysphoria and what treatments are helpful and what treatments are not. We have lived experience within the church that knows that there is no way to pray away the trans, to pray away dysphoria, and that, so this is my judgment, that people who claim to have prayed it away, either their dysphoria was not very strong and could be managed by wearing a pink shirt or a blue shirt or whatever, or they're lying, which is probably the more likely thing. And maybe that is gaslighty to them, but I don't believe it. We've learned too much about Exodus International, and we've learned too much about, I know too much about my own lived experience. But we live in a culture that tells us we're crazy. We live in a culture where Matt Walsh and the Daily Mail are making documentaries called What is a Woman? That is, this really hardline argument that, sex and gender are one and the same, and that you can't separate them, and that they're binary in two separate categories, and that there's no, that people can't change their sex and people can't change their gender, that there's no such thing as an intrinsic sense of gender identity. There are threads of our culture that tell us that this is crazy. So there's lots of reasons why doubt might come up. I want to talk for a few minutes, about some specific situations that have led me to feel doubt, especially on this side of transition. And like I said, it feels a little bit dangerous to admit any of this because of the pressure that's on us to be exactly right. And, for me, I'll just say on the outset that despite the doubts that I do sometimes experience, I don't regret my decision of coming out, and I certainly don't regret transition. And I am happier and more fulfilled than I ever have been in my entire life, and more than I really ever thought was possible. And that doesn't mean it's not hard sometimes. I mean, you've heard me on this program, if you ever listened before, you've heard me bitch about how hard it is to exist as a trans person and how hard it is to be visibly trans. So, this is the life that I'm choosing, and it's also the life that I've been given. And there are goods and bads and ups and downs. And even though I experienced some doubts, I would still choose to do what I did over again. And probably if I went back in time with the wisdom that I have now, I would have come out and transitioned a lot earlier in life. But so here are some situations for me where I have had that sense of self-doubt come up, or, sometimes it feels like what trans people talk about, and not just trans people, but all different people talk about imposter syndrome, so-called imposter syndrome, but just those feelings of self-doubt. This week I got sucked into a Reddit and then Twitter diatribe about the binary bimodal spectrum of sex and gender, sort of this idea of that, morphological and phenotypical characteristics of sex are spread out over a spectrum, and that they generally organize themselves bimodally, meaning they kind of organize themselves into two clumps, but that they exist along a spectrum. So if you were to take the characteristic of height, right, you would see that organized across this spectrum where there would be an overlap. And most the women would be, in general shorter than men, and most of the men would be taller than women. But obviously there's overlap where there's some women that are taller than men and so on. And you could apply that to essentially any morphological or phenotypical feature that has to do with sex, whether it's, genitals, the shape of genitals at birth, those might be more more pronounced, but the existence of intersex people and intersex babies, there's a wide range of morphological genitals born at birth, right? Breast size, the amount of hair, the amount of facial hair or not, foot size, finger length, hip width. I mean, like literally anything you could think about in people's bodies. It exists in some fashion on that spectrum. And, certainly as a whole, it is organized into these bimodal spectrum. And this is something that this model, I'm not going to talk anymore about it because I'm not a biologist, but it's been really helpful to me to identify that. Even in terms of chromosomes, like most male, people assign male at birth are XY. Most people assign female at birth are XX. But there's a whole spectrum of variations, and they have, different morphological consequences, right? There's XXX, XXY, there's fragile X. There's all kinds of different, versions. This idea of the bimodal spectrum is something that I learned about from Julia Serrano, who I've mentioned often in the show, but also through Siddhartha Mukherjee, who wrote a great article in Nautilus called "Why Sex is Mostly Binary but Gender is a Spectrum," and it discusses the genetic cascade that begins with the SRY gene. There's one switch that generally has an influence on like a multitude, millions and millions of other genetic switches that come below. And it's fascinating. Anyway, so I ended up in this Twitter thread where this TERF person was dismissing this as a concept, and was, really conducted the argument. It was both a red herring and a straw man. A straw man is when you, pretend like you're arguing against the argument or the concept, but you're really arguing against some other version that's easy to defeat, the straw man, right? And then the red herring is when you sort of, bring up this other unrelated idea that you can argue against and defeat, and use that to try to say that you're defeating the actual argument. So anyway, that's essentially what was happening. But for me, emotionally, it brought up a lot of doubt. It was really unpleasant. It was really disturbing because, for me, this bimodal spectrum of sex and phenotype has been really, really helpful for me in making sense of my experience and the way that I experience gender. Now, obviously, science evolves and we learn new things and we have to leave old things. So that's part of the thing. But for me, that's a situation where I felt some doubt well up in me, and it was really unpleasant. Earlier this week, I ran into a former colleague, someone who I pastored with years ago. We crossed paths at a local store. This person, shouted my name, my correct name, bless them. And just, we chatted for a few minutes, and it was fine. But as I was walking away from that, I felt just this gut kicking sadness. This was someone that I had worked with, I had conversations with, I had worked on a couple of projects with them. I had admired their work, and connections with their family, all kinds of things. And, this was the first time I'd seen them in 2 years. And, there are moments like that where, I think and feel to myself, like, what have I done? I think about the losses. I think about the things in my life that have gone away. For me, maybe is unique to me in some ways. I had the privilege of having a full career for nearly 20 years as a pastor prior to transition. I know that isn't something that everyone has. But I had that privilege, and I had wide professional connections, this whole community, and I essentially lost it all in a moment. I mean, there are some from that spiritual community that I still have connections with, but by and large, it's like 98% of those people, professional acquaintances and former colleagues and people I've worked with, and professionals in their own field. Like, I mean, like, a lot of life is about, at least a lot of professional success is about making connections with people, and, not like calling in favors, but kind of like calling in favors when the need comes. And for me, transition rendered those relationships by and large gone. It's a huge loss. And so there are moments when I reflect on those losses, and I've talked about this in the podcast some, but there are moments when I reflect on those losses and I feel doubt come up in myself. And I'm touching myself here because, like, for me, I feel it right here. This is where I feel that doubt, and it feels equal parts empty and tight. And I feel it, and it's there. What have I done? What am I doing? This is crazy. That's what doubt feels like to me sometimes. There are times when, other times when I have doubt come up, it's when I'm out in public and I'm surrounded only by cisgender people. Like I went on a trip a few weeks ago back to the Northwest, and I have pretty good, especially now, like I have pretty good queer radar. I have pretty good trans, maybe not. I don't know. Like, trans people are absolutely amazing, and we're everywhere. And you probably don't, well, I guess maybe some of us listening, but like, I think that we see and interact with a lot more trans people than we realize because of how amazing we are. But certainly for me, being out in public, where I'm surrounded by who appear to be cisgender heterosexual people, it can feel really lonely. It can feel really isolating. It can feel like I'm like the only one. Like I'm the only one here. Like, and I'm this really strange, unusual person. And I do think that where I was up in the Northwest was a segment of the world where almost certainly the population density of queer people is lower than in Southern California, or like, fucking Palm Springs where I work, which is like, one of the queer capitals of the West. But it feels very different. It's dark. Maybe because I work in Palm Springs, it feels so particularly, stunning in that shift. But for me, a lot of times when I'm in those environments where everyone around me seems to be cishet, it feels lonely, and those doubts, start to creep up. Likewise, there are times when I see trans people who are, easily clockable, right? For me, when I see other, girls like me, there is often equal parts encouragement, because it's like, oh, wow, I'm not alone. I'm not as lonely as I thought. But also, a lot of times seeing other clockable trans people, and I'm, one of them. I'm pretty clockable. I get gendered correctly most of the time, but, I think people can kind of figure it out if they look very closely at all. But for me, it also brings up my own transphobia, my own internal transphobia. And I see myself in them. And I see the internal disgust that I have for myself. It's my own work, and it's not about them, but this is just my truth, all right? This is me. This is my show, Transgender Woman Talking. But I feel my own transphobia come up, and I feel that sense of disgust. And again, it's, what have I done? What am I doing? I'm living my life in what was my greatest fear for so long. doubt. That's doubt. There are times when, another one, there are times when I've felt doubt creep up when I've seen men who are happy, who are not terrible, who are comfortable in their own skin, who are not like, living. And by what I mean by terrible is like they're not like living a life of like, this toxic pretending masculinity where, you never show weakness and you can't be sad. You only can be funny or happy or serious. But like seeing men who are genuinely mature, strong, confident human beings who carve out a place for themselves and who are able to express their masculinity and their femininity. There are times when I ask myself, like, could I have been like them? Doubt comes up, right? Would my life be easier if I could just find a way to be content as like this, emotionally intelligent man who cries sometimes? It's doubt. And of course, the truth is that I was that fucking man. That's who I was trying to tell myself that's who I was. That's who I was presenting myself in the world as. That's who I was trying to be. I was giving my whole all in order to be content being that kind of man. And I wanted to die because it wasn't me. I wasn't true. And God, like being true to who we actually are, instead of like settling, instead of wrestling with it, instead of whatever, it's worth so much, even with the suffering that it brings, even with the doubt that might come up. There are times when, and we're getting to the end here, all right? There are times when I feel like I'm pretending. There are aspects of femininity, there are aspects of performing the gender of woman that are learned. And, I have peace with that. Like, just because I'm learning these things in my early 40s and, the average cisgender girl learned these things at 8 and 12 and 14 and 21. They didn't learn them any less than I'm learning them. It's just a matter of difference in timelines. And the fact that I'm learning them doesn't make performing them any more artificial than they're performing of them, right? And there are moments when that performance feels especially highlighted in me, and it feels like I'm pretending, and it feels like I'm asking other people to pretend with me. Again, I'm being really honest with you. And it feels like at times where it feels like, as much as I like to be a woman, I'll always just be a man. And that's what doubt feels like sometimes. For example, right now I'm reading this book called We Were Beautiful, or I can't remember what it's called. It's How Beautiful We Were is what it's called. And it's a really powerful novel. And it's this story, and I'm not done with it yet, so I don't really know how it concludes, but it's by Imbolo Mbue, and it is really just powerful story, how beautiful we were. And it's set in this, fictional African village that is ravaged by American corporations. Like it's the story, it's a story that's common in many parts of the world that were colonized. Anyway, there was a conversation in one of the chapters that I just read, maybe even today or yesterday, where women were very closely identified with their womanhood, with their fertility, with menstruation, with physical traits that develop along with, endogenous female puberty. And, many of those experiences I will never have. And it feels othering, and it highlights this feeling of like, am I pretending? Again, on this trip I just mentioned, when I was up in the Northwest, there was a conversation about possibly going to a water park, which, sounds fun and sounds great. But for me, I just couldn't do it. I couldn't go. I'm not at the place where I could feel any level of confidence being in a women's changing room. Now, I pee in the women's bathroom, but like you've heard me talk about in this show, I generally try to find single stall places. I don't want to be beat up. I don't want to be harassed. I don't want any kind of violence. And even though technically speaking, the women's changing room is where I belong, I also would at this point feel really, really uncomfortable and really, really scared. I'm a preoperative trans woman, and I can pass pretty well when I have clothes on. But that the thought of being in that space feels terrifying, and that for me brings up this sense of, like imposter syndrome. And there's this common phrase amongst especially trans people who are, their eggs are just cracking, or they're just trying to make sense of where they are. And they ask the question, is wanting to be a girl the same thing as being a girl? And for most trans people, they would say, yes. Like, this is part of the reality. And that's the kind of, ideology that Matt Walsh and other TERFs condemn. That they have, this more of this spirit of, gender essentialism, or gender, intertwined with sex. But there are a lot of experiences that cisgender people have that trans people don't share. And it leads to some doubt. I love how Lizzo actually answers that hypothetical question: is wanting to be a girl the same thing as a girl? In her song "Like a Girl," Lizzo, look it up. Like a girl. There's in the refrain, in the bridge, she says, "If you feel like a girl, then you're real like a girl." And I listened to an interview actually where she was talking about writing that song, and she said that that's her favorite line on the whole album. And it is an incredibly powerful and affirming one. It's one for me that helps soothe some of these doubts, that I belong with women, and that my experience as a woman is different from many women, and it overlaps as well, and it is valid. So here we come now to the end. Oh my God, I just spilled this whole cup of water on my desk and on my keyboard and mouse and everything. So I had to have an emergency toweling session. But so to come to the end of the program, I wanted to end kind of where I began, and talking about how it feels unsafe to have or express doubt. And when I first moved to California, I moved for a pastor job. I moved down here to take a job as a lead pastor of a church, and I was something that I had hoped for and wanted for many years, and it felt so exciting and validating to be invited into that place. At that time, I didn't know I was going to be transitioning. I thought that I could be content living as a man still at that point. I hadn't gone through suicidal ideation and all that kind of stuff really at that point. Just, lots of depression, lots of dissociation, but I was, still kind of limping through life. And, the first sermon that I preached when I came down here to Southern California was a sermon about doubt. Very first sermon, very first one. And I told the congregation that it's impossible for you to have faith unless you also have doubt. It is impossible for you to be faithful to God. It's impossible for you to be a good person, to be a good Christian. It's impossible for you to have a spiritual life unless you also have doubt, which in a lot of ways felt like a really unpastorly thing and a scary thing to preach, but I believe it with every ounce of my heart and soul, and I still believe it. And it might also be true that part of being trans is also having doubt, and that you can't be trans unless you have doubt. And in fact, honestly, if a trans person I ran into never experienced doubts in their life, I might myself wonder if they're being a little too Pollyanna, if they're not really truly being honest with themselves, or if they're, compensating for something, or they're covering up for something, because I think that the experience of doubt is like part and parcel of being trans. And so if you're someone who has experienced doubt, whether you're early or late on in transition, welcome. Welcome. Doubt is part of the experience of being a trans person. Thanks so much for listening. My name indeed is Elle, and I'm a transgender woman talking. You can reach out to me. There's an email address in the show notes. Like I said, this episode has been videoed and will be up on YouTube this week. Always, I am eager to hear your constructive feedback, suggestions for the show. I'm working on hopefully getting some interviews of folks in the coming weeks. We'll have some other people on, kind of expanding the scope of the transgender woman talking. Maybe we'll have transgender people talking, or just people talking about transgender people, or maybe just people talking in general. I don't know. But thanks so much for listening once again. And this is Elle saying goodbye.